You might imagine that empires are built on strategy, conquest, and glory. But sometimes they are also built on feet, not the heroic feat of soldiers storming a city wall. We're talking literal feet, calloused, slippered, and attached to mid-level bureaucrats in Constantinople. In the Byzantine Empire, a place where paperwork held more power than swords, these feet were occasionally called upon for the strangest administrative duty of all, measuring rugs. Let's rewind the scroll. It's the 9th century CE. Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire, buzzes with the kind of slow bureaucratic hum that only an empire obsessed with order can sustain. Amid the domes and marble colonnades, armies of clerks shuffle across dusty palace floors in sandals, scrolls clutched tightly in their ink-stained hands. They work not for conquest or poetry, but for something far nobler: inventory. Accurate, exhaustive, absolutely sleep-inducing inventory. You see, Byzantium was a civilization of lists. From grain to goats, olive oil to official titles, they documented everything, often several times. And in this well-documented world, rugs were serious business. Rugs in Byzantium were not mere floor coverings. They were diplomatic gifts, religious, symbols, tax assets, and markers of rank. Some were imported from distant Persia, others woven in Anatolia or Syria. Their beauty could stop a monk mid-chant, but only if their measurements lined up. And for that, the empire needed a unit of measurement that everyone could recognize. Enter the paus, the Byzantine foot. Technically, the paus measured about 0.313 meters, or roughly the length of a moderately sized male foot. But in practice, it varied. Why? Because many bureaucrats use their own feet. Imagine it. A delegation from a provincial town sends a tribute of rugs to the imperial treasury. The rugs arrive, ornately packed in camel-hide bundles, smelling of dye and dust. A junior official is tasked with assessing them. No ruler on hand? No problem. Off comes the shoe. He paces heel to toe across the woven field, counting 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot, 11 feet. There. Done. The rug is officially 11 feet long, or more accurately, 11 of his feet long. Of course, there were standard rods and tapes as well, but these were often lost, warped, or unavailable. In an empire that stretched from Sicily to Syria, improvisation was a necessary art. Feet, being both portable and attached, were convenient, and since officials often recorded not just the length but whose foot was used, future audits could, in theory, be recalibrated. The Treasury archives, dozens of scrolls long, reveal a near-obsessive interest in these matters. Rugs were catalogued not just by design or origin, but by the precise foot count used. A 12-foot rug by Theodorus, a 10.5-foot rug by Helena. Yes, some were measured by women. A 13.2-foot rug measured by Demetrios the Lame, whose measurement sparked no small amount of bureaucratic confusion. But why such fuss? Why not use a wooden rod or a string? Well, it turns out that in the event of dispute, feet were not only available, they were accountable. You could summon the measuring official in person, have him take off his shoe, and retrace the measurement before the Imperial Review Board. This was less dramatic than a trial, but perhaps equally embarrassing. It wasn't only rugs either. Feet were used in measuring floor space, shipping cargo holds, even the width of new roadways being constructed into the Anatolian interior. The practice speaks to something deeper, the Byzantine obsession with precision through imperfection. Their system recognized human variance and, in its own sleepy way, leaned into it. One might picture a quiet moment in the late afternoon, somewhere in a palace courtyard, a junior clerk removing his sandals under the fig trees to measure a tapestry for shipping records. A scribe watches silently, ink drying in the sun. A cat whines between their ankles. Another bureaucratic moment, unnoticed by history, until now. These rug measuring routines seem hilariously inefficient, and by modern standards they were. But in a society where imperial legitimacy depended on ritual and continuity, even foot measured. Floor coverings played their role. A rug measured today might adorn the floor of a provincial bishop's hall tomorrow, quietly radiating imperial authority beneath the feet of barefoot monks and visiting merchants. And what of those rugs today? Most have vanished. The records remain, sometimes with meticulous notes. Width 8p, measured by foot of Marcus, curled at edges, smells of saffron. One wonders, did Marcus ever imagine his feet would be immortalized not in marble, but in ledger entries? And what does it mean that something as humble, and yes, boring, as foot-measured rugs formed part of the machinery of one of history's most enduring empires? You return now to the halls of Constantinople, the great glittering seat of the Byzantine Empire, not to witness a coronation, a siege, or a theological debate, but to observe something far more enduring: paperwork. While warlords may ride and emperors may plot, it is the desk-bound scribe who ensures the empire doesn't fall apart on a Tuesday. At the heart of Byzantine governance lay the logothesia, the network of offices tasked with administering everything from taxes to textile deliveries. The logothetes, to Geniko, General Logothete, was the minister overseeing the treasury, and his clerks were the ones most often assigned to those now infamous rug measurements. It's easy to dismiss these nameless officials, Theodorus, Helena, Demetrios the Lame, as inconsequential, yet each was a vital cog in a machine designed not to conquer, but to endure. So why such precision over rugs? To begin with, rugs weren't just decor. In Byzantium, a rug could be a bribe, a symbol of submission, a tax payment, or a religious endowment. In the vast and diverse lands of the empire, where coinage fluctuated and barter remained common, items like rugs had standardized value. A Persian silk carpet woven in Tabriz might be assessed at 5 numismata. A local Anatolian wool rug, perhaps 1. And so measuring them wasn't about aesthetic judgment. It was about calculating value for imperial records. Each imperial province had quotas to meet, and rugs, being transportable and often luxurious, were a common form of in-kind tax from rural estates or urban guilds. If you were a landowner in Thrace and owed the state 30 numismata in tax, you might instead send 3 rugs, each valued at 10. Provided they passed inspection, of course. Enter our friend Marcus. Let's say he receives a rug from a tax caravan. His duties aren't merely to assess its dimensions. He also must check fabric type, regional origin, dye quality, and, of course, whether it curls at the edges. All of this is logged in exhausting detail on wax tablets or parchment scrolls, most of which were stored in chilly record rooms called chartophylakion, literally scroll vaults. And what about those vaults? You might picture dark, cool spaces filled with stacks of scrolls, their ends tied with coloured cords. Some rooms had specially shaped pigeonholes carved into stone or wood for sorting records by region, material, or year. The chartophylax, or keeper of the scrolls, was often a monk or retired official, entrusted with the soothing task of maintaining bureaucratic order in a world prone to chaos. Records were everything. They allowed the imperial capital to monitor distant provinces, to track gifts from foreign courts, to spot tax evasion and, perhaps most critically, to maintain memory. Because in Byzantium, memory was governance. To forget a shipment, a tribute, a rug, it wasn't just bad administration. It was a potential crack in imperial authority. And those rugs weren't just measured and stored. Some were redistributed as ceremonial gifts. Others adorned the halls of minor fortresses or were used as altar cloths in provincial churches. Few were even used to decorate tombs, though only those deemed too threadbare for ceremonial reuse. But the process wasn't without its controversies. Disputes occasionally arose over measurement discrepancies, especially when officials disagreed over whose foot had been used. Some enterprising scribes even began advocating for authorized feet, that is, standard foot measurers whose body parts were considered the official unit in a district. This led to the strange phenomenon of imperial footmen, not guards or messengers, but literal foot havers, whose sole responsibility was to lend their feet to measurements. There are at least 2 recorded incidents in the 10th century when arguments over rug measurements escalated into minor provincial riots. In one case, a local scribe's measurements were rejected by the central treasury, resulting in a loss of income for a monastery. In another, a rug merchant bribed a clerk to use the smallest footed official available, thereby increasing the recorded length of his goods. That clerk was caught and reassigned to latrine duty in Cappadocia. Naturally, as with any good bureaucracy, solutions were attempted. By the late 10th century, some treasury offices began issuing calibrated measuring sticks, known as bematistaria, but these were often used alongside feet, not instead of them. Old habits died hard, and many field officials trusted their own methods over tools they viewed as urban innovations. Plus, some of these sticks were made from wood that warped in humidity. A warped stick versus a well-fed bureaucrat's foot. Many preferred the latter. As the empire expanded and contracted, the rug measuring continued. From the quiet fortresses of Armenia to the seaside tax offices of Crete, officials continued to pace off tapestries, their sandals slapping softly against stone. Some may have grumbled. Others took pride in their precision. A few likely nodded off mid-measurement. The bureaucratic culture even trickled into the language. The phrase, "to count one's steps in cloth," became a proverb for meticulous, if unnecessary, diligence. It appears in several letters from monastic officials to imperial scribes, and, yet one cannot help but marvel. In an age where kings could lose heads over a single battle, here was an empire where rugs were logged in triplicate, foot lengths argued in court, and clerks debated the fairness of imperial toes. The sheer commitment to accuracy, through such mundane means, helped hold together a civilization that lasted for over 1,000 years. So where does that leave us? At the feet of it all, literally, we find a society that prized routine, record-keeping, and human adaptability. Whether out of necessity, tradition, or stubborn pride, Byzantines embraced a measuring method that may seem absurd today, but which served its purpose for centuries. Still, one wonders, did the clerks ever laugh at themselves? Was there a knowing smirk when a rug measured exactly 12 feet and a bunion, or did the gravity of empire weigh too heavily, even on their toes? And perhaps more intriguingly, what became of the feet themselves? Were they ever honored, memorialized, or quietly forgotten under new systems of tape and rod? Let's step, quietly, into the final corridors of this forgotten story. By now you've walked beside the sandal-clad officials of Byzantium, measuring their world not in leagues or liturgies, but in the unassuming length of human feet. You've seen how rugs, so humble and decorative to us, once pulsed with bureaucratic significance, marked, logged, and valued as instruments of imperial function. But what did this slow, repetitive ritual say about the Byzantine worldview? To answer that, we need to look beyond the wool and parchment to the deeper cultural rhythms of the empire. Byzantium, for all its wealth, theology, and military pomp, was, at its heart, a civilization of continuity, a place where order was worshipped almost as fervently as God. The meticulousness of rug measurement wasn't just about taxation, it was about assurance. In an age when messages could take weeks to travel, when provinces rebelled as often as they paid tribute, and when earthquakes could erase cities overnight, consistency became sacred. Knowing that a rug from Antioch was measured using the same official's foot as one from Thessaloniki gave the illusion, however fragile, of control. This was no small matter in an empire whose borders were constantly shifting, and indeed, as the centuries wore on, the Byzantine Empire did shift, geographically, politically, even spiritually. But the record-keeping endured. The language of administration ossified into a nearly sacred form of Greek. Titles like protovestiarios and chartularios tokanikleou persisted through dynastic changes. Bureaucrats were trained not to innovate, but to preserve. Rug measurement might seem absurd now, but within this world, it was a small ritual of control. a measurable moment in an empire obsessed with documentation, much like lighting the same incense each morning in the Hagia Sophia, or reciting prayers in a fixed rhythm. Measuring rugs by foot was part of the empire's unspoken liturgy of order. It also raises a broader historical truth. Great systems often hinge on very small, often boring things. Roman roads, famously straight, were maintained not by emperors, but by local magistrates checking drainage ditches. Chinese dynasties rose and fell with the accuracy of grain records. In the Ottoman Empire, coffee consumption habits were tracked by neighborhood to assess moral order. And here in Byzantium, a foot and a rug could affirm that tribute had been paid, that records were correct, and that the state was still awake, even if nodding off. So what became of all these measurements? Some survive. A handful of archived tax scrolls in Mount Athos still list rug assessments from the 11th century. A monk named Alexios recorded 15 rugs, measured by the senior foot of the Merchants' Guild, including color notes like sea green and Persian gold. Scholars have puzzled over whether senior foot implied age or rank. Both interpretations are equally charming. By the time the 13th century arrived, and Constantinople fell temporarily into Latin hands during the Fourth Crusade, the precision of the imperial bureaucracy had begun to fade. Western knights, less enamored with record-keeping, looted the rugs rather than cataloguing them. Still, in a few surviving documents from the restored Byzantine court, the practice of foot measurement persists, fainter but alive. It's likely that by the fall of Constantinople in 1453, rug measurement had modernized. Perhaps wooden rods had finally overtaken the humble foot. Perhaps not. The Ottomans, who succeeded them, brought their own meticulous systems of tax and inventory, but they too found wisdom in standardization. And what about the people? The bureaucrats who walked rugs into the historical record left few other traces. Their names, if remembered at all, exist as marginalia, scribbled in shaky ink on the corners of scrolls, or scrawled in notes like, verified by Helena's foot, well worn. They lived modest lives in a system that prized invisibility. Yeah, be an effective clerk was to disappear into procedure. There is something oddly touching in that. We often measure greatness by visibility, by names carved in stone, victories on the battlefield, grand architecture. But the clerks, the record keepers, the quietly foot-measuring scribes of Byzantium played their part in a different kind of endurance. They were the slow pulse of the state, not thrilling, not memorable, but steady, like footsteps on a marble floor. And so here you are, centuries later, thinking about the foot of an unnamed scribe who once measured a dusty carpet from Cappadocia, recorded its size in feet, perhaps his own, and then walked home for dinner. A rug, a unit, a record. Nothing grand, but part of something bigger. In the end, this is what boring history really is. Not meaningless, just quiet, unhurried, hidden beneath the louder stories. And so we leave Marcus, Helena, Demetrios the Lame, and the others to their scrolls, their sandals, and their measuring. Their job is done, though their work endures, in the footnotes of footnotes, in ledgers never read again, in the silence of forgotten routine, because sometimes history is measured not in miles, but in the length of a foot. You are standing in the arid Sahel, just where the grasses of the savannah begin to yield to the shimmering golds of the desert. The year is somewhere around 1312. The air smells of sun-warmed dust, crushed millet, and leather. In the distance, a camel flicks its tail, utterly unaware that history is about to unfold at its padded feet. This is where the story of Musa Keita the Firm, later known as Mansa Musa, quietly begins. He wasn't supposed to be emperor. Not by plan, nor by bloodline, not in the way legends often promise. But history tends to take its time, favoring detours and dull contingencies over heroics. And in the case of Mansa Musa, it began with a voyage, one he didn't even go on. You see, Musa was not the reigning Mansa or ruler of the Mali Empire when our story opens. That position belonged to his predecessor, Abu Bakr II, who had an oddly specific obsession: the Atlantic Ocean. According to Musa's own retelling later in life, when people finally began asking him questions, Abu Bakr gathered an enormous fleet of ships, filled them with sailors, food, and fresh water, and sent them west into the unknown. Only one ship returned. The rest disappeared into myth. Undeterred, Abu Bakr organized a second, even larger expedition. But this time, he left himself. Before departing, he appointed Musa as deputy ruler, a kind of interim monarch, expecting to return in due time. He never did. And so, with no great drama or coronation, Musa became Mansa, not by sword nor intrigue, but by the tides of another man's curiosity. It was an unglamorous ascent, but no less real. When Musa assumed the throne, he inherited one of the largest empires in the world, stretching from the Atlantic coast deep into the interior of West Africa, covering parts of what are now Senegal, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger. The empire included cities like Timbuktu and Gao, rivers like the mighty Niger, and most importantly, resources, grain, salt, and above all, gold. In fact, so much gold. To modern minds, it might be difficult to grasp what rich meant in the 14th century, but by all accounts, the Mali Empire under Musa controlled over half of the world's known gold supply. Not metaphorically, literally. But to understand the scale of this wealth, you must first grasp what the empire valued. Gold was not currency, in the way we understand coins or paper. Rather, it was wealth embodied, in bangles and bricks, in gilded saddles, in delicate jewelry worn by griots as they recited poems under starlight. Musa's capital, Niani, was not a city of gleaming marble. It was a practical place, built with mud brick and wood, shaded by baobabs and clustered around the Niger. But what it lacked in ostentation, it made up for in organization. Trade caravans passed through in droves. Slabs of salt from the Sahara were exchanged for millet, dates, and cloth. Scholars arrived from North Africa. Horses clopped through the city's gates bearing letters, spices, and sometimes royal wives. The Mali Empire had wealth, yes, but also a sense of order. Musa inherited this vast humming system, and from his earliest days, he seemed less interested in conquest than in consolidation. He strengthened the empire's bureaucracy, re-established trade routes, and made sure tax was collected, not just in coin or cowrie, but in kind, livestock, grain, even woven mats. Still, the great moment, the one you've heard whispered in, textbooks and trivia nights had not yet arrived. That would come later, with camels. But before the caravan and the gold-drenched pilgrimage, we must pause here in the earliest days of Musa's reign. Because these quiet years matter. Too often, history jumps straight to spectacle, to the glittering march to Mecca, to Musa handing out gold like breadcrumbs, to European cartographers frantically redrawing maps just to accommodate his fame. But before all that, there were years of planning, of careful growth, of political listening. Musa wasn't just a man of wealth, he was a man of patience. One of the earliest and most overlooked decisions of his rule was the investment in education. Musa encouraged Islamic learning, but also respected local traditions. He sent envoys north to negotiate scholarly exchanges with cities like Fez and Cairo. He supported the copying of religious texts by hand. He even began construction on libraries, long before Timbuktu would become a scholarly hub. It's easy to miss how radical this was. Many rulers build palaces. Musa built archives. He didn't conquer with armies. He expanded Mali's influence through reputation, by creating a system in which merchants, scholars, and holy men wanted to live, trade, and teach. And through it all, the gold sat quietly beneath the soil and in the stores of the state. In the markets, Malian gold was traded in dust form, pinched between fingers or stored in tiny leather pouches. To touch Malian gold was to touch the currency of Cairo, Damascus, even Florence. Still, Musa had yet to leave his mark on the wider world. Within his own empire, he was growing respected, even revered. But beyond Africa's borders, few had yet heard of him. That was about to change. One can imagine Musa rising before dawn one morning, perhaps after prayers, quietly resolving to make a pilgrimage, not just a religious act, but a geopolitical performance. One that would send a message not through banners, but through behavior. He would not ride alone. Camels would be loaded, roads mapped, scholars summoned. Months of preparation would go into a journey that, once begun, would never be forgotten. Not by Cairo, not by the Mediterranean, not by history. But as the hooves began to shuffle and the gold was wrapped in velvet and stacked in baskets, one question lingered in the air. Like desert dust, how much is too much gold to give away? Before the world begins to change around you, the year is 1324. The sun rises not over Niani, but over the endless sandscape of the Sahara. And you, though barefoot in imagination, are part of the largest caravan West Africa has ever seen. This is not exaggeration. This is the pilgrimage of Mansa Musa. The Hajj, the journey to Mecca, is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, a duty for the faithful who are able. For Mansa Musa, the pilgrimage was not only a spiritual obligation, but also an opportunity, a statement, a subtle performance in a world where maps were redrawn, not with borders, but with reputation. And so he prepared, carefully, lavishly, logistically. Estimates vary, of course. Records were written decades later, filtered through hearsay, envy, and the sheer disbelief of observers. But most agree on the basics. Mansa Musa set off with a caravan of 60,000 people. Yes, you read that right. 60,000 attendants, soldiers, servants, scholars, cooks, merchants, translators, and bearers. Each wore fine fabrics, many spun from gold-threaded cotton or imported silks. Many carried walking sticks tipped with gold. Every official was flanked by an entourage, and then, of course, there were the camels. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, groaning softly under the weight of golden bricks, leather satchels of gold dust, jars of honey, dried meats, bolts of cloth, Qur'ans, spices, dates, and water skins. The animals were tended by herders who knew their rhythms, stopping at oases precisely when needed, adjusting loads by the hour. Some accounts say 100 camels carried gold alone, each laden with over 300 pounds of treasure. That's not wealth, it's an atmospheric pressure. The caravan moved slowly, not just because of size, but because of ritual. Prayers were held 5 times a day. Meals were prepared with care. Evenings were spent in music, poetry, and quiet discussions under lanterns. Musa himself travelled in the heart of the procession, housed in a travelling pavilion with golden finials and embroidered curtains. He rode a horse or a litter borne by men, depending on terrain and occasion. He was not merely going to Mecca, he was carrying Mali there with him. As the caravan crossed into Egypt, news began to ripple ahead. By the time Musa reached Cairo, the city was buzzing with anticipation. The Mamluk Sultan, Al-Nasir Muhammad, ruled from a splendid court. Cairo was then one of the largest cities in the Islamic world, cosmopolitan, complex, and suspicious of outsiders. And then came Musa. He did not enter the city with fanfare, but he didn't need to. Just the scale of his procession stunned the locals. Eyewitnesses claimed that the markets were clogged for days, and that gold dust spilled onto cobblestones like saffron. When Musa declined an immediate audience with the Sultan, out of protocol, not pride, it caused a small diplomatic stir. But once the two did meet, it was clear this was no ordinary visitor. Musa gave gifts, lavishly, to scholars, to judges, to merchants, to the poor, to officials, to random onlookers. In his weeks in Cairo, he distributed so much gold that, according to several reports, he caused a local economic downturn. Yes, that's right. Musa's generosity accidentally destabilized the value of gold in Egypt for over a decade. The inflation wasn't malicious. It was the sheer abundance. Gold became common. Traders suffered. Prices spiked. And yet, for Musa, this was merely generosity, a kind of sacred giving, a way to fulfill religious obligation and political theatre in one slow, gilded breath. Cairo had never seen anything like it. And so too did Europe begin to hear whispers. Maps produced in the decades that followed began to place a golden king in West Africa. The 1375 Catalan Atlas, drawn in Spain, depicts Musa enthroned, a crown atop his head, a nugget of gold in one hand and a scepter in the other. He is labelled simply the richest man in the world. And yet, amid the legends and exaggerations, the real Musa remained a quieter figure. In his conversations with scholars in Cairo, he sought not fame, but books. He reportedly asked after religious teachers who could return to Mali with him. He requested architects and jurists. One such architect, Al-Sahili of Andalusia, would travel back and help build some of Mali's greatest monuments, including a mosque in Gao and the famed Djinguereber Mosque in Timbuktu. This was perhaps Musa's true brilliance, not just to give gold, but to spend it on knowledge. While his pilgrimage dazzled the world, it also functioned as a recruitment tour. He was not just throwing money at the earth. He was fertilizing Mali's future with it. And so, when the gold had been spent and the blessings received and the prayers recited on the dusty plains outside Mecca, Musa began the long journey home. But something had changed. He was no longer merely emperor of Mali. He was now known across the Islamic world, from Cairo to Constantinople, from Al-Andalus to Baghdad, as the Black King of Gold. His empire, once remote, was now discussed in souks and seminaries. Mali had become a part of global consciousness, not through conquest, but through caravans. And yet, one lingering question followed the hooves of those returning camels. You were walking through the streets of Timbuktu, not today, but in the 1330s. Dust coils softly in the air. The buildings are not the limestone columns of Europe, nor the tiled roofs of East Asia. No, here they rise in gentle earthen mounds, tapered walls of sun-baked mud brick, smoothed each year by hand. And through the winding alleys comes the hum of life. Traders shouting prices in a dozen languages, students reciting verses from open Qur'ans, the beat of drums drifting faintly through the palms. Mansa Musa has returned, but he hasn't brought just memories and sand in his cloak hems. He has brought architects, blueprints, books, scholars, and scribes, tangible artifacts of the world he walked through on his pilgrimage. And this final chapter of Musa's life, so often eclipsed by the spectacle of gold, may well be the most enduring. After his return to the Mali Empire, Musa began a deliberate and quiet transformation of his kingdom. It wasn't a dramatic affair. No one conquered a new land. No one invented a new currency. It was, rather, a steady layering of knowledge onto the soil of West Africa. His first and most significant project was the elevation of Timbuktu as a center of learning. Now, Timbuktu had already existed before Musa, established as a Tuareg trading outpost in the 1100s. But under Musa's direction, it evolved into a city of books and scholars. The Djinguereber Mosque, designed by the Andalusian architect Al-Sahili, rose from the earth with its massive Qibla wall and intricate woodwork. Unlike European cathedrals, this mosque wasn't meant to scrape the heavens, but to shelter the spirit. It became the heartbeat of the city. Beside the mosque, Musa helped establish one of the oldest known universities in the world, the Sankore Madrasa. Not a single structure, but a network of learning centers where scholars taught jurisprudence, astronomy, medicine, theology, mathematics, and poetry. Students sat cross-legged in shaded courtyards, ink-stained fingers scribbling in Arabic, debates echoing off mud-plastered walls. By the late 14th century, this scholarly ecosystem would contain tens of thousands of manuscripts, more than many European cities at the time Some of those documents still survive today, wrapped in leather and stored in private libraries, guarded through war and weather alike. Musa didn't just donate books. He created a culture in which books became currency. Meanwhile, other cities across the empire saw similar flourishes. Gao received its own mosque. Niani became better fortified and organized. Markets grew in size and complexity, standardizing weights and measures. And perhaps most importantly, Musa built a bureaucratic class that could manage the vast territory of Mali. Scribes, tax collectors, and officials who relied not just on oral tradition, but written record. This might seem dull. That's the point. For all his golden grandeur, Musa's true genius was administrative. Like any good ruler, he made the machine run more smoothly. Still, for all his wisdom, Musa ruled in a world not free from challenge. The empire was vast, and the Sahel unforgiving. Droughts, raids, local uprisings, and the slow erosion of trade. Roots all loomed, and gold, while abundant, could not buy eternal peace. Musa attempted to pass on his legacy carefully. His son, Maga, was named as successor and likely co-ruled in Musa's final years. But as with many dynasties, the weight of greatness proved difficult to bear. After Musa's death, around 1337, though records are hazy, the Mali Empire continued to flourish for several more decades, but cracks began to show. Successive Mansas struggled to hold together the delicate web of tribute states and merchant alliances. The empire's influence slowly receded, and by the 15th century, it would be challenged by the rising Songhai Empire. Still, the legend of Musa never quite faded. In Europe, cartographers continued to place a bejeweled Musa on their maps for centuries. The idea of a fabulously wealthy African king became a kind of mirage, exotic, distant, and misunderstood. Later colonialists would twist that image into caricature. But in his own time, Musa was not a fantasy. He was real, grounded, fluent in strategy, faith, and statecraft. Even today, echoes of his influence remain. In the libraries of Timbuktu, countless manuscripts still sit, weathered, sacred, largely unread. Testaments to a time when a king made books the bedrock of a civilization. In the architecture of Sahelian mosques, Musa's preference for humility over grandeur can be seen in every tapered tower and hand-sculpted buttress. And in the global economy, Musa's pilgrimage remains one of history's most fascinating case studies in unintended consequences. Few individuals have ever impacted monetary policy across continents simply by giving too much away. So when we ask how rich Mansa Musa really was, we should perhaps look beyond gold. Yes, he held the weight of the world's treasure in his saddlebags. But, more importantly, he knew how to turn wealth into wisdom, stone into schools, and a caravan into a memory that still ripples through time. And yet, one last question settles quietly in the still Sahel air. What might the world look like if more kings had traded their riches for libraries? You wake in the soft hours of a spring morning, somewhere in Edo-era Japan. The year is perhaps 1776, but this is not a Tokyo of neon signs and bullet trains. This is Edo, wooden homes, dirt roads, merchant carts creaking past, and cherry blossoms blooming like pink smoke across temple gardens. You are not a samurai or a court noble. You are, more likely, a merchant's daughter, or a carpenter's apprentice, or a calligraphy tutor who has saved up one precious day for leisure. And today, at long last, the sun is out and the air is light. It is the season for hanami, flower viewing. But before you go admire the blossoms, you must prepare something far more important than a poem or a parasol. You must pack a picnic basket. And, in Edo, Japan, this is no quick sandwich and fruit affair. This is a cultural event. Picnicking, especially during hanami, was a finely tuned performance. It was as much about visual pleasure as taste. The bento box wasn't just practical. It was an art form, and like so many arts in Edo, Japan, it combined elegance, restraint, and a surprising number of tiny compartments. Let's begin in your kitchen, or what passes for one. There's no oven, no refrigerator, no electricity. But you have a brazier, a mortar and pestle, and your wits. Most importantly, you have seasonal ingredients, which are the heart of Edo cuisine. The rice is already cooking. You rinsed it 3 times last night to remove the extra starch. Your packet's still warm, shaped into triangular onigiri, wrapped with salted nori. Some are filled with pickled plum, umeboshi, sharp and mouth-puckering, believed to stave off illness. Others hide little treasures of grilled salmon or soy-simmered mushrooms. Next, you turn to the tamagoyaki. This is not your average scrambled egg. No. Tamagoyaki is made by slowly rolling layers of sweetened egg into a log, then slicing it into perfect golden cubes. Your bamboo mat lies ready, as do the chopsticks you'll use to carefully flip and fold. It's slightly sweet, gently browned on the edges, and firm enough to hold its shape in the box. Then come the side dishes, packed with contrasting textures and colors. Slippery strands of sesame-dressed spinach, goma-e, pickled daikon radish cut into flower shapes, lotus root slices with holes like lace, simmered carrots, fried tofu, and perhaps a tiny cup of miso-marinated eggplant. And it would not be a hanami bento without a few sweets. Small balls of mochi dusted with kinako, toasted soybean flour, or a triangle of translucent yolk jelly made from red bean paste. All of this is arranged inside a lacquered jubako, a multi-tiered picnic box, usually black or red with gold detailing, sometimes passed down through generations. The jubako is more than just a container. It's a stage. Each layer is a curtain rise. Each bite, a miniature act of the season. When you're done, you wrap the whole thing in a colorful furoshiki cloth, knotting it tight to keep everything tidy for transport. But food is only one part of the Edo picnic ritual. You also pack your tools for entertainment, a folded fan, a bound book of haiku, and perhaps even a small shamisen if someone in your group is musically inclined. Some carry a silk handkerchief with handwritten poems to read beneath the trees. Others bring small flasks of sake, carefully brewed from polished rice, to sip with friends and trade compliments like incense smoke on the wind. If you're wealthy or connected to a merchant family, you may even have hired a local vendor to prepare your box for you. The Edo streets were full of early food entrepreneurs who specialized in seasonal bento deliveries. Think of them as the Uber Eats of the 18th century, only with more poetry and zero packaging waste. Soon, you're walking toward the riverside or temple garden, where others have already staked out their blankets. Someone's servant waves a fan to keep away the bees. A group of children plays near the water, and every few minutes someone yells, "Kirei!" So beautiful, at the blooming cherry trees. You sit, unwrap the cloth, open the box, and reveal your edible mosaic. Each item has been chosen for harmony, color, seasonality, and portability. And as you begin to eat, slowly, gratefully, you take part in a cultural rhythm centuries in the making. This is not just lunch. It is a moment in time, framed by tradition, flavored by memory, and choreographed by chopstick. But not everything is idyllic. There are ants, for one, and a bit of wind has sent some petals into your food. A nearby group is playing shamisen slightly out of tune, and your friend has spilled some miso on her sleeve. You laugh. She laughs. It is, after all, not about perfection. It's about presence. You lean back, looking up through the blossoms, and you wonder, how did something as simple as a packed lunch become a national art form? As you sit beneath the cherry blossoms, your bento carefully unwrapped and mostly eaten, it's tempting to believe this tradition has always existed as it does now, serene, refined, beautiful. But like most things in history, the picnic bento is the polished tip of a much larger, messier story. One that winds through fish markets, ferrymen, ink-stained menus, and a staggering number of soy sauce barrels. To truly understand the Edo-era picnic, you must return to the city itself. Edo, the shogun's seat of power, was one of the largest cities in the world by the 18th century. Over 1 million residents packed into a dense, wooden hive of neighborhoods crisscrossed by canals, bridges, and narrow streets. Unlike Kyoto, the old imperial capital, Edo was a city of newcomers, merchants, craftsmen, fishmongers, entertainers, and itinerant poets, all jostling for space and livelihood, and they were hungry. Edo's food culture evolved to suit the needs of this bustling urban population. Meals had to be quick, seasonal, and transportable. Enter the street vendors, the unsung heroes of everyday dining. You can imagine them calling out from their stalls. The soba seller with his steaming pot slung across a shoulder pole. The tofu merchant with fresh blocks nestled in cool water. The grilled eel vendor, fanning hot coals under skewers glazed with sweet soy sauce. Among these was a class of cooks who specialized in bento boxes, pre-packed meals meant for laborers, scholars, travelers, and eventually for flower viewing parties. These weren't the elegant jubako of the upper class, but sturdy wooden boxes wrapped in cloth, stacked in woven baskets, or carried in lacquered pails. You could pick one up before boarding a river ferry, or bring one with you on a temple pilgrimage. Bento, in this form, evolved into subgenres. Some of the most popular included makunuchi bento, or between-the-acts boxes, sold outside kabuki theaters. These were designed to be eaten quickly during intermissions and included a little of everything: grilled fish, pickled vegetables, rice balls, egg, and sometimes even seasonal fruit. A kind of Edo-era variety box. Kaiseki-style bento, inspired by the elegant meals served during tea ceremonies. These were more refined, often purchased from high-end tea houses for special outings. They featured delicate ingredients: yuzu zest, shaved bonito, chestnuts simmered in syrup, or sweet eggplant roasted in miso, ekiben, the earliest versions of train station bentos, though the railways wouldn't fully develop until the Meiji period. For Edo travelers taking long boat rides or crossing mountain passes on foot, these portable meals were essential. The demand for bento was so high that some tea houses offered custom orders, with the more prestigious ones carving the customer's name into the wooden lid. It was a small flex, pulling out a bespoke meal under the blossoms, your name etched above a bed of daikon pickles and sesame spinach. But the Edo bento wasn't just food. It was a social signal. A neat, seasonal, artfully arranged bento implied refinement and restraint. It showed you knew the rhythms of nature, that you understood it was improper to pack pickled plum in summer or mushrooms in early spring. A person who brought fresh bamboo shoots in April or persimmon in late autumn was seen as in tune with the times, much like how today we might admire someone who brings locally sourced, in-season produce to a dinner party. On the other hand, AAE bento thrown together with pickles out of season or greasy fried tofu meant something else. Perhaps lower class, rushed, or worse, unmindful. This idea of seasonal mindfulness, shun, was central to Edo cuisine. It shaped not only how people cooked and ate, but also how they thought about the world. Nature wasn't just a backdrop, it was a calendar, a teacher, and a critic. Even the vessels used for bentos told their own quiet stories. Farmers often used simple bamboo boxes tied with twine. Merchants might invest in carved cedar or lacquerware. Wealthy families kept elaborately painted jubako with gold cranes and red plum blossoms. Many people wrapped their bento in printed cotton tenugui, often decorated with poetry, humor, or family crests. But beyond the aesthetics and seasonality, bento culture thrived because it fit the tempo of Edo life. The city was always in motion. Laborers worked sunrise to sunset. Scholars moved from temple schools to public lectures. Theatergoers lined up for tickets at dawn. Everyone needed something quick, neat, and satisfying to carry with them. The bento box, efficient, portable, beautifully layered, fit the need perfectly. Yet it wasn't all efficiency and etiquette. Some vendors turned the bento into performance. You might see a seller juggling skewers or chanting the ingredients of his box in rhyme. Others competed by offering the most generous serving of rice, or an unusual twist, adding pickled chrysanthemum leaves perhaps, or layering a second compartment with candied walnuts. And of course, as with all food traditions, the rules weren't always followed. Some people packed pickles in the wrong season. Others added too much fish sauce. And some simply didn't care, munching their bentos beside the river with little regard for aesthetics or poetry. But even that casual disregard was part of the story. The Edo picnic was many things at once: art and appetite, ritual and rest, status and simplicity. And the real magic of it all wasn't just in the meal itself. It was in the fact that everyone, from samurai to servant, participated. Everyone wrapped up a bit of rice, a few vegetables, maybe a pickled plum, and went out to sit beneath the trees. You finish your own box now, brushing a petal from your lap. Across the grass, another group is unwrapping their lunch. Their bento is different from yours. More fish, fewer sweets, perhaps store-bought. But they too laugh and share and raise their little porcelain cups in quiet celebration. And as the breeze stirs the blossoms above you, you wonder what other hidden rituals are tucked away inside something as small and ordinary as a lunchbox. The sun has begun to dip below the rooftops of Edo. The light that once filtered softly through cherry blossoms now casts long golden lines across the tatami mats and wooden porches. Your bento box is empty, save for a few crumbs and a pickled radish slice you've saved for last, sour and sharp on the tongue, a final punctuation mark at the end of a long, slow sentence. And yet, even after the food is gone, the experience lingers. This, it turns out, is not accidental. In Edo period Japan, a bento was never just a meal. It was a conversation with time, an exercise in mindfulness, a philosophy quietly folded into layers of rice and seaweed. To understand why, we must turn not to the picnic blanket, but to the thinkers and aesthetic ideals that shaped Edo society. Most notably, the concept of wabi-sabi. This worldview embraced imperfection, transience, and the quiet beauty of the ordinary. A chipped ceramic bowl, a weathered wooden lid, the fleeting perfection of a spring blossom just before it falls. These were not seen as flaws, but as features, and in every carefully packed bento box, wabi-sabi was present, sometimes in the irregular curve of a plum, other times in the slightly off-center placement of a radish flower. Even the act of eating slowly was deliberate. Meals were not meant to be devoured. Instead, they were meditative moments, each bite a reminder of where the food came from, who prepared it, and what season it belonged to. It's why many bentos included a small leaf or even a pine needle, natural, decorations meant to evoke the time of year and the changing world around you. And then there was the matter of portion control. Unlike the indulgent banquets of Europe, or the overstuffed trenches of medieval feasts, Edo bentos were modest by design. Small portions, balanced colors, just enough to satisfy, never to overwhelm. This reflected Shojin Ryori, the Zen Buddhist-influenced vegetarian cuisine that valued simplicity, restraint, and balance. Even when meat or fish was included, it was more accent than centerpiece. Food in this context became a kind of poetry, meant to be savored, observed, and remembered, not just consumed. This philosophy filtered into daily habits too. The way one carried the bento, unwrapped it slowly, cleaned the chopsticks after use, and folded the cloth again to take home. These small gestures weren't rules. They were rituals, ways of anchoring the self in the moment, and in a rapidly growing, ever-changing city like Edo, these rituals mattered. In fact, one of the reasons the bento became so popular wasn't just its convenience. It was that in the midst of noise, trade, politics, and weather, it offered a portable pocket of peace, a box of order in a chaotic world, which may be why the bento tradition endured through earthquakes, regime changes, westernization, and into modern Japan. Even today, office workers eat kombini bentos at their desks. School children open lunchboxes with tiny compartments for sausage cut into octopus shapes. Train stations sell ikiban, still inspired by Edo flavors, to travelers, rushing between cities. But the essence remains the same: seasonality, balance, and care. care in preparation, care in presentation, and care in the act of eating. You clean up now, slowly repacking the furoshiki, brushing off the last of the petals. Around you, other groups are doing the same. Some are singing softly. One man is writing in a small notebook. A child is licking the sweet syrup from a plum dumpling, her fingers sticky and pink. You glance once more at the now empty bento box, its lacquered interior gleaming in the low light. You think of the farmers who grew the rice, the vendors who sliced the pickles, the artisans who carved the jubako decades ago, and the generations before you who also sat beneath the blossoms and did the same. You begin to walk home. Your steps are slow. You're not just full, you're grounded. And as the city lights begin to flicker on, soft and amber against the dusk, you can't help but wonder, what might we gain today if we packed our lives like an Edo bento, simply seasonally, and with just enough beauty to slow us down? In the golden heart of the Tang dynasty, amid lacquered columns and jade-lined courtyards, there lived a deer. Not just any deer, but a palace deer, cosseted in silk, fed sweet pears by eunuchs, and hand-brushed by concubines with more poetry than responsibility. This deer, whose name may or may not have been recorded, history is vague on this, and deer rarely keep diaries, belonged to Emperor Xuanzong of Tang, a ruler known more for his poetic inclinations and leisurely governance than for any revolutionary conquest or reform. His reign, particularly in the early years, is often described by historians as prosperous, culturally vibrant, and when you squint at the day-to-day details, surprisingly uneventful. And yet, it's in the quiet stories, the ones where nothing quite happens, that history becomes oddly restful, like a still pond reflecting the larger world around it. Let us settle in for this particular tale. Xuanzong reigned from 712 to 756 CE, a lengthy period for a Tang emperor. The empire at the time stretched wide, from the steppes of Central Asia to the coastal ports where silk and tea would begin their long journeys west. But back in the capital city of Chang'an, within the palace walls of the Daming Palace, the pace of life for the court elite was leisurely. The emperor himself was fond of music, calligraphy, and the art of not being particularly bothered. He established imperial music academies. He hosted poets. He commissioned murals of cranes and waterfalls. He took long walks under moonlit skies, with attendants carrying lanterns shaped like lotuses. And, as noted in obscure court records, he adored animals, especially one particularly docile white deer. This deer was no wild creature plucked from a hunt. It was a symbol. In Chinese cosmology and court culture, the white deer had long been seen as an auspicious animal. Its appearance was believed to signify a ruler's virtue and the blessings of heaven. So naturally, when one wandered, or was delivered, into Xuanzong's orbit, it was welcomed not as livestock, but as a minor celestial being. The deer was given a small enclosure near the imperial gardens, close enough for the emperor to visit daily, should he wish to. He did. Often. While the empire churned outside, taxes collected, caravans dispatched, armies drilled, the emperor would sit in quiet repose near the deer's pavilion. Some days, he fed it lotus roots dipped in honeyed water. Other times, he simply watched it chew. If the deer wandered too far, it was gently coaxed back with the soft clinking of bells. Palace ladies were instructed to compose poems about it. One reportedly read, "More placid than ministers, more loyal than generals, the deer bows only to the breeze." There were no great scandals, no fatal incidents, no rousing hunts. The deer did not lead a charge into battle, nor did it die tragically in the emperor's arms. Instead, it lived on, eating, blinking, occasionally sneezing into silk bedding, and gently existing. It is possible, probable, even, that some members of court found the deer's presence odd, that a grown man, emperor of the world's most populous empire, would spend hours admiring a ruminant. But this was Tang China, where spiritual calm and poetic expression were seen as extensions of wise governance. In fact, some scholars today view Xuanzong's court as a kind of curated retreat from the chaos of previous dynasties, a place where aesthetic governance mattered, where having the right bamboo groves and correctly spaced koi ponds was not frivolous, but an assertion of harmony and order. So perhaps the deer, quiet, unfussed, serenely unconcerned with politics, was a kind of ideal courtier. Of course, not everyone was equally at peace with this pace. While the emperor meditated with his deer, more active-minded ministers worried over border disputes and inflation. Letters arrived from the frontiers. A general requested more horses. A governor sent reports of drought. A Buddhist monk returned from India with new scriptures. But often, these missives waited a day or 3 for the emperor's attention. The deer, meanwhile, received immediate audiences. And yet, curiously, this period in Tang history was deeply stable. Perhaps it was the quiet. Or perhaps Xuanzong's apparent detachment was a strategy in itself, delegating wisely while projecting a sense of heavenly calm. The palace chroniclers wrote of this time in gentle, rhythmic prose. The gardens bloomed. The tea was fragrant. The emperor hummed softly under his breath. The deer dozed in the sun. But of course, the world has a habit of turning, even when you're not watching. Especially when you're not watching. In the quiet shadows of the capital, beneath the placid gaze of plum trees and peacocks, changes were already forming, both personal and political. Xuanzong was growing older. The deer, too, though healthy, had begun to move more slowly. The emperor's attention, once focused on poetry and pets, began to drift elsewhere. A new figure appeared in court, Yang Guifei, the beloved consort whose story would soon take center stage and eventually lead to the dynasty's most dramatic turning point. But for now, we leave that future unopened. For now, the emperor sits cross-legged on a stone bench, a scroll in one hand and a slice of pear in the other. The deer blinks, slowly beside him, the bamboo rustles, a page turns, and as you drift deeper into this moment, you might ask yourself, what kind of empire is built on silence, poetry, and the contented chewing of a deer? The deer, as we have seen, did little. It grazed. It wandered. It blinked its soft eyes at the cherry blossoms drifting down through the spring air like lazy ash. And yet, somehow, in its gentle uselessness, the deer came to symbolize something much larger about Emperor Xuanzong's early court, a strange and rare kind of political quiet. But palace life, no matter how silken and slow, was never as peaceful as it appeared from the outside. Within the Daming Palace, life moved to its own rhythm. Eunuchs whispered down long corridors. Scholars composed poems on the subject of cloud formations. Ministers debated which musical scale most appropriately reflected spring. And behind it all, the emperor, now well into his reign, remained serenely detached. His deer, so lovingly attended to, became a minor celebrity in court gossip. Attendants speculated over what fruit it preferred that week. Someone wrote an entire essay comparing its temperament to Confucian ideals of filial piety. There were even rumors that foreign emissaries were shown the deer as a sort of diplomatic treat, evidence that Tang China had, quite literally, nothing urgent to worry about. But of course, not everyone was soothed by serenity. In particular, the bureaucrats. The Tang administrative system was vast and demanding. Thousands of officials oversaw taxation, irrigation, law, and grain stores across the empire. And yet, at the center of this enormous web, sat a man more interested in moonlit poetry and pet companionship than budget reports. Xuanzong wasn't neglectful. He simply governed by not interfering. He trusted his ministers, at least the ones who didn't make too much noise. He delegated. He accepted petitions slowly. He made decisions only when absolutely necessary. And in his long silence, an entire style of courtly behavior evolved around him, one marked by excessive formality, patience, and theatrical subtlety. Promotion, for example, was never a matter of achievement alone. It required the right calligraphy style on one's reports. the proper phrasing of metaphors in a seasonal greeting, an understanding of when to flatter the emperor indirectly, perhaps by praising the plum blossoms outside the deer's pavilion, rather than the deer itself. And then there were the concubines. While the emperor had once taken long walks with scholars and indulged in musical performances, his attention began drifting, naturally, toward the inner palace. The harem was large, hundreds, of women, many of noble birth, others brought in for their beauty, grace, or singing voices. Some came with ambitions, others simply hoped for comfort. Into this slow swirl of personalities came Yang Yuhuan, later known as Yang Guifei, a name that would eclipse even Xuanzong's in the annals of romantic tragedy. But at this point in our story, she was merely a court figure of rising influence, first entering the palace as a concubine of one of Xuanzong's sons, before eventually capturing the emperor's attention herself. She played the pipa, a four-stringed lute, with such melancholy elegance that entire evenings reportedly passed with no other sound but her music and the crunch of the deer nibbling lotus stems outside. Xuanzong, increasingly captivated, began spending more and more time in her quarters. The deer, it is said, was eventually relocated to a quieter pavilion, still well fed, still brushed with soft rakes and perfumed oils, but now more a symbol of what the court had been than where it was going. Outside, the world churned. Merchants arrived from Samarkand, their camels heavy with lapis and almonds. Buddhist pilgrims debated Taoist priests in the public squares. Drought hit parts of the south. Bandits raided a provincial outpost. In Anxi, a powerful general named An Lushan grew both in fame and ambition, a figure who would later test the very stability Xuanzong had so serenely enjoyed. But at court, things remained curiously still. This is not to say the court was naive. Rather, it had grown so skilled at doing nothing with dignity that warning signs often appeared as elegant puzzles rather than alarms. An over-budget building project might be described in verse. The riverbank swells with ambition, yet the granaries sigh. A troubling military report might arrive folded into a scroll of lotus sketches, as if hoping the art would soften the message. Through it all, the emperor continued to drift deeper into leisure. He and Yang Guifei rode together through the palace gardens. Musicians played slow, drifting melodies beneath wax candles. The deer occasionally reappeared for festivals, garlanded with ribbons and poems. And in this dreamlike pause before the storm, one begins to understand the fragility of stillness. What do you do when the most powerful man in the empire prefers ink to armor? How do you prepare for political change in a place where change itself is considered gauche? Tang China, at this time, was like a painting in the style of Shan Shui. Mountain water art. Balanced, misty, idealized. Beautiful, but slightly detached from reality. And just as in those paintings, where distant figures walk paths that lead nowhere in particular, so too did many at court find themselves wandering in circles, unsure if movement itself was welcome. But of course, deer do not remain in palaces forever, nor do empires remain at peace without vigilance. As we prepare to move into the final section of this story, a question begins to rise. When stillness becomes the norm, does it become a strength or a subtle kind of surrender? For over 3 decades, Emperor Xuanzong reigned in what many historians call the Golden Age of Tang China. Under his rule, the empire was wealthy, artistic, and bureaucratically sophisticated, marked by calm more than conquest, elegance more than expansion. But no, Golden Age lasts forever, and even the stillest ponds can be disturbed by the faintest ripple. The story of the emperor's beloved deer, once brushed, adorned, and softly spoken of in court poetry, fades from the official records around this time. Like so many living things in history, the deer likely passed without grand announcement or ritual, having lived its gentle life and done little more than exist quietly. But the symbolism of the deer, of that quiet, contemplative phase of Xuanzong's rule, was about to vanish with it. For as the emperor aged, his attentions narrowed, his love for Yang Guifei grew more consuming, and his disinterest in governance deepened into detachment. This was not neglect in the conventional sense. It was something subtler, an empire governed by habit, by delegation, by ritual and routine, a court drifting in its own poetry. And into that silence walked a man who did not write poems. And Lucian, the powerful general from the northeast border, began his rise as a military prodigy. He was charismatic, calculating, and oddly charming. He entertained the court with his awkward dancing, won favor with Yang Guifei, and flattered Xuanzong in exactly the right ways, offering strength where the emperor offered serenity. He was, for a time, the empire's favorite soldier. But then came the rebellion. In 755 CE, Lucian marched on the capital with a vast army. He declared himself emperor of a rival dynasty, and suddenly the long stillness of Xuanzong's court, its soft poems, its perfumed evenings, its carefully folded silences, cracked open like a dropped porcelain bowl. The emperor, unprepared and disoriented, fled the capital. The story of this flight is tragic and well known. As the imperial procession made its way south, soldiers, hungry, tired and angry, demanded that Yang Guifei be executed, blaming her family's political meddling for the empire's vulnerability. Xuanzong, broken and tearful, reluctantly agreed. Under a tree somewhere in the countryside, Yang Guifei was strangled with a silk cord. She died quietly, like so many other figures in this tale. Not with dramatic flair, but with the same understated stillness that once marked the emperor's reign. When the rebellion was finally crushed, after 8 devastating years, it had changed the face of the empire. Tens of millions were displaced or killed, whole provinces lay in ruins, the economy faltered, the once unshakable authority of the Tang imperial court was deeply weakened. Xuanzong abdicated soon after, retreating into a kind of melancholy exile. He lived quietly until his death in 762, never fully recovering from the collapse of the world he had once ruled with such untroubled grace. As for the deer, it had long since vanished. Some say it died of old age before the rebellion. Others suggest it was quietly butchered during the palace's hurried evacuation, though no record confirms this. More likely, it simply passed away one uneventful morning, as deer often do, its life unmarked by the drama swirling around it. But in a way, the deer had always been more symbol than story, a gentle mirror of an emperor's values, his approach to power, his belief that peace could be preserved by avoiding motion. And so we end this tale not with a bang, but a question. What are the costs of peace without vigilance? Xuanzong's early reign was undeniably successful. His era birthed poems that are still memorized today. His music academies shaped centuries of Chinese culture. His reign was one of unusual prosperity and relative freedom. But when crisis finally came, the court, trained in ritual, not resilience, was slow to act. The deer, in all its gentleness, had taught the court stillness, but it had not taught it what to do when the world began to move again. And as you drift off tonight, perhaps you can imagine that deer, somewhere, in a garden now overgrown, standing motionless among the lotus plants, ears twitching, watching the empire it once lived in slowly stir from its dream. You are standing on the cobbled streets of Paris sometime around the 1670s. The air smells faintly of chimney smoke and chestnut carts. A light drizzle taps gently against your bonnet or hat, depending on fashion and status, and you clutch your shawl or cloak just a little tighter. Now, imagine seeing someone ahead of you unfurl a strange contraption, a wide, curved canopy of oiled silk mounted on a slender stick. They hold it aloft, sauntering past puddles, dry and smug as a duchess at mass. You pause, because umbrellas, yes, umbrellas are new. Suspiciously new, and not everyone is entirely sure they should be used in public. Let's go back a little. Before the 17th century, Europe was not particularly fond of umbrellas. The ancient Chinese had used collapsible parasols for centuries, and the Middle East had perfected sunshades. But in Europe, especially in France, The weather was something one simply endured. Rain was a social equalizer, and the idea of shielding oneself from it, particularly for a man, was viewed as both impractical and faintly unmanly. Women, of course, had parasols, but they were for sun protection, not drizzle. And so, for much of early modern Parisian life, people went without. Enter the pluie problem, the sheer volume of Parisian rainfall. By the mid-1600s, Paris had become crowded, grimy, and increasingly urbanized. Streets flooded, gutters overflowed. And yet still, no one carried umbrellas. Until, that is, a small number of fashion-forward urbanites began importing a curious accessory from England and Italy, waterproofed umbrellas. And suddenly, chaos. Not chaos in the grand revolutionary sense, of course. This was not the storming of the Bastille. This was polite, grumbling, sideways glancing chaos, the kind that begins in salons and ends in pamphlets. At first, umbrellas were seen as theatrical. A few eccentric nobles began carrying them, particularly during visits to Versailles. They were made of silk, reinforced with whalebone or bamboo, and varnished to repel moisture. But they also blocked views at outdoor events, dripped on passers-by when folded, and sparked questions about public manners. Could one carry an umbrella into a church? Should you tip it when passing someone of higher rank? What happens if it pokes a marquis in the eye? These may sound like minor issues, but in 17th century Paris, manners were political, and in a society obsessed with etiquette, umbrellas, awkward, space-invading, and prone to collapsing at inopportune times, were suddenly at the center of a kind of urban drama. Part of the tension was class-based. At first, only the wealthy could afford umbrellas. They were handmade, imported, and associated with foppish aristocrats or overly delicate clergymen. This meant that when someone from the middle classes carried one, it could be read as pretentious. And when the lower classes began to adopt them, often in the form of cheaper oilcloth knockoffs, it became a small but visible act of social defiance. And then there was the gender debate. In Parisian society, it was considered somewhat indecent for men to be seen protecting themselves from the elements too carefully. Rain was considered character building. A man was meant to stride through the downpour like a romantic hero, cloak flapping, boots splashing. Carrying an umbrella looked cowardly, or worse, vain. Pamphleteers mocked the trend. Satirical drawings appeared of dandies huddling under parasols, noses in the air. Plays made subtle jabs at umbrella carriers as weak or ridiculous. But despite the mockery, the umbrella slowly took root. The Comte de Valancourt, an etiquette writer of some renown, penned an entire section in his 1682 treatise on urban comportment, titled Concerning Instruments of Personal Shelter. He acknowledged the umbrella's practicality, but warned against unseemly crowding beneath a single canopy, and advised ladies to avoid prolonged concealment beneath unfamiliar umbrellas, lest their reputations be clouded likewise. Other words, sharing an umbrella was now socially charged. Public officials were equally confused. Should umbrellas be taxed like canopies or treated as accessories? Were they to be allowed inside theatres? What if someone opened one during a funeral procession? To make matters worse, early umbrellas were imperfect. They snapped in wind. They leaked. Their mechanisms jammed with a tragic regularity. Some folded only with brute force and emitted alarming creaks. They were also large, larger than modern umbrellas, making them a hazard in narrow streets. And yet, people persisted. Because despite all the grumbles, snickers, and minor disputes, the umbrella had obvious advantages. It kept you dry. It preserved wigs and lace cuffs. It prevented one's bonnet from slumping like a soaked pastry. But the etiquette of how to carry one still hadn't been solved. By the end of the 17th century, Paris had split into two camps: the umbrella apologists, who defended the object as modern and civilized, and the umbrella skeptics, who insisted that public spaces were too crowded for such a selfish invention. Meanwhile, printers and artists capitalized on the debate. One widely circulated etching showed two gentlemen in a duel, their swords crossed and umbrellas held aloft, neither willing to risk the rain while defending their honour. The image came with the caption, "Let the heavens weep, but let our stockings remain dry." As the century drew to a close, the umbrella was still not entirely normalised. In some districts, people muttered under their breath as someone passed beneath one. Others began to accept it as a new reality of urban life, like coffee houses, street lanterns, and noisy opera singers. And yet, the real transformation wouldn't come until the next century, when a stubborn man in London would walk the streets with an umbrella every day, rain or shine, for 20 years straight. But that's another story. Here in late 17th century Paris, we end this first chapter in the rain-soaked life of the umbrella with a curious question. When does a simple tool become a statement? And who decides what makes it proper? The umbrella was never merely a tool. In 17th century Paris, it became a theatrical object, an unwitting actor in the social drama of urban life. While it protected its carrier from the rain, it also exposed them to judgment, satire, and sometimes open conflict. Let's return to the streets. Picture the Palais Royal during a spring drizzle. Fashionable Parisians promenade beneath rows of chestnut trees, glancing slyly at each other from beneath their powdered wigs. Rain patters softly on stone. A young nobleman, perhaps recently back from London, strides into the square holding a crimson silk umbrella edged in gold fringe. He is alone, but his presence draws a ripple through the crowd. Whispers, a few narrowed eyes, and then perhaps a quiet laugh. You see, by the 1690s, umbrellas were tolerated, but just barely. Their presence at the theatre, in churches, and especially at cafes, became a matter of whispered etiquette. Would someone open an umbrella while seated beneath the outdoor colonnade? Would they share it with a lady on a narrow street, risking the touch of gloved hands? In some cases, such small matters turned into scenes, and more than once, into duels. There is a remarkable and thoroughly pointless record in the Gazette de France from 1697, in which two minor aristocrats, one a chevalier, the other a banker's spoiled son, are said to have come to blows over the insistent and discourteous unfurling of an umbrella during a crowded exit from a performance at the Comédie Française. Accounts vary. Some say the umbrella had snagged the lace cuff of the other gentleman's coat. Others suggest it was simply opened too flamboyantly, flinging droplets onto nearby wigs and corsages. Either way, insults were exchanged. Seconds were appointed. The duel was conducted in the gardens of the Hôtel de Sens the next morning. No one was seriously injured, though one umbrella was reportedly cleft in twain. Another story, possibly apocryphal, possibly exaggerated by dramatists, tells of a woman who refused an umbrella offered by a passing stranger, only to slip in the mud moments later. When the man offered it again, she is said to have retorted, "Sir, I would rather bathe in the Seine than owe my dryness to a man with such questionable taste." In both cases, we see the same underlying theme. The umbrella had become a social test. Would you share it? Would you accept it? And what does your answer say about you? There was even a growing genre of short satirical essays in popular almanacs titled things like The Philosopher and the Parasol, a treatise on slanting rain, and notes on the etiquette of inclined drip. Writers used the umbrella as a metaphor for the times, a shield from discomfort, yes, but also a sign of how much people were beginning to value convenience over courage. Indeed, the French attitude toward umbrellas was deeply bound up with the idea of masculine virtue. Men were expected to brave the elements, to suffer a bit for dignity. The very act of using an umbrella, especially in public, threatened this performance. And yet, more and more men quietly adopted them anyway. In shops near the Pont Neuf, you could now find umbrellas for sale, tucked between ivory snuff boxes and scented gloves. They were still expensive, certainly not everyday items, but they had moved from oddity to minor luxury. Their materials ranged from varnished silk to oiled linen, often with carved wooden handles shaped like animal heads or angelic cherubs. Design. Innovation too began to appear. French artisans, ever alert to fashion, worked to slim the profile of the umbrella, improve its hinges, and make it easier to fold discreetly. There are advertisements from the late 1690s boasting umbrellas that open without violence and close without injury to sleeves or fingers. One particularly optimistic seller promised a model that could withstand the worst gusts of the Parisian Mistral. Though this claim was widely mocked, still, the umbrella's social complications lingered. Couriers, coachmen, and fishmongers began to improvise their own forms of protection. Cloaks waxed with animal fat, hats reinforced with stiffened leather. But actual umbrellas remained rare among working-class Parisians, partly due to price, and partly due to the lingering notion that they were a foppish indulgence. That didn't stop people from borrowing them. A curious phenomenon arose in the 1690s, umbrella-sharing societies. These informal arrangements often involved a single well-to-do neighbour who owned an umbrella, and several others who would knock on their door during storms to borrow it for short errands. Some enterprising clerks began renting umbrellas to passers-by. For an hour or two, an early form of public utility, though there was no formal system in place. Naturally, this led to a new set of anxieties. What if the umbrella wasn't returned in time? What if it broke? Was it rude to offer money for its use? Or was that worse than assuming you'd get it for free? Even the church weighed in. Some priests warned parishioners that the umbrella was a symbol of pride, a tool of vanity that discouraged gratitude toward God's natural world. Others, more practically minded, pointed out that soaked hymnals and wet pews were no help to anyone. In the middle of this cultural confusion stood the umbrella, folded or unfurled, elegant or absurd, protective or pretentious. The paradox was that even as it shielded individuals, it disrupted communities, especially in crowded, socially sensitive places like the theatre, marketplace, and public gardens. And so, as the century neared its close, Paris was full of little umbrella dramas. Umbrellas offered and declined, shared and regretted. Umbrellas praised in letters and mocked on stage. Umbrellas as both private comfort and public controversy. It had not yet become the quiet, unquestioned object it is today. And so we end this second part with a soft question, as gentle as a spring. Rain. Can something be truly useful and still remain socially unaccepted? Or must we first agree on the shape of dignity before we agree on how to stay dry? By the turn of the 18th century, the umbrella had taken its place not just in Parisian weather but in Parisian life. Quietly, over years of drizzle and downpour, it shifted from a social curiosity to a tolerated, then expected part of public behaviour, though the journey was far from smooth. Let us return once more to the cobbled streets. In 1703, a pamphlet circulated anonymously in the Café and Salon of Paris, titled De l'ombrelle moderne, une réflexion sur les mœurs urbaines. It was equal parts satire and social critique, a gentle, tongue-in-cheek defence of the umbrella, urging citizens to accept it not as a sign of vanity, but of modern dignity. It argued that true manners lay not in exposure to suffering, but in choosing comfort with elegance. This pamphlet marked a turning point. It helped transform the umbrella from foppish novelty into a civilized necessity. While still the domain of the upper classes, umbrellas now appeared in etiquette manuals, fashion journals, and even plays, no longer mocked outright, but wryly, accepted as part of urban life. Of course, the old tensions lingered. Theatres still struggled with them. Their size and stiffness made them cumbersome in crowded foyers and balconies. Some venues experimented with umbrella storage stations, essentially wooden racks near the entrance, but theft, confusion, and damp coats became common complaints. Churches, too, adapted slowly. It became customary to lean umbrellas gently against pews, provided they were closed and did not drip excessively on the floor. A priest in Saint-Eustache allegedly gave an entire sermon in 1708 about keeping one's spiritual house as orderly as one's umbrella, though no transcript survives. And then came the tradespeople. By the early 18th century, a small but notable number of umbrella repairers had set up shop in Paris. These artisans, often working from narrow booths or shaded corners of the market, offered replacement ribs, restitching of torn silk, and re-oiling of leaky seams. For the first time, people could maintain their umbrellas instead of discarding them. A sign, perhaps, that they were no longer symbols, but tools. Some enterprising shops began to offer custom umbrellas, shaped to the customer's size and gait. There were parasols for women, wide and floral, designed more for sun than rain. There were collapsible models for gentlemen, thin enough to tuck beneath a coat. Even children's umbrellas began to appear, tiny and largely ceremonial, but adorable nonetheless. Still, not all embraced the change. A few stalwarts of the old code continued to resist. In letters from the countryside, noblemen still joked about Paris's fear of drizzle. One wrote in 1712, "I visited the city and counted no fewer than 7 umbrellas in the space of a single block. I am convinced the rain here is made of vinegar, so eagerly do they flee it." But the tide was turning. In 1715, an enterprising merchant named Etienne Lemaire opened what is believed to be the first dedicated umbrella boutique in Paris. Simply titled Maison de la Parapluie, it featured display windows showcasing models in silk, linen, and even fine leather. His slogan, "La pluie est un fait, la grâce est un choix." Rain is a fact, grace is a choice. He sold out in his first season. Soon, umbrellas began, appearing in portraits, not just as accessories, but as proud markers of civility. A 1717 oil painting by Nicolas de Largillière shows a noblewoman in a garden, holding a parasol aloft, while her dog sniffs curiously at the base. Her expression is serene. It is no longer odd to see her holding it. It is expected. At the same time, umbrella sharing faded. As more citizens acquired their own, the old neighbourly system collapsed. Rentals became formalised, eventually regulated by local guilds. Umbrellas became personal, like gloves or spectacles. And so, over just a few decades, the umbrella travelled a peculiar arc, from imported oddity to contested object, to fashionable scandal, to polite accessory, to humble tool of daily life. And what does this tell us? Well, perhaps that etiquette is never fixed. It is a negotiation, a slow conversation between what people need and what they're willing to be seen needing. The umbrella, in its quiet way, tested the limits of propriety, not through revolution or controversy, but through repetition, through rainy mornings, through damp cloaks, through the simple human wish to be dry and dignified at the same time. By the mid-1700s, children would scarcely believe there had ever been a time when umbrellas caused duels. In one of the final, umbrella-related entries in the journal Mercure Galant, dated 1721, a gentleman writes, "I passed 3 men in the rue Montorgueil, each bearing an umbrella of different make. None bowed, none mocked, and none slipped. I declare this century a civilized one, and maybe that's how it always happens, not with a thunderclap, but with a drizzle that no one bothers to fear anymore. So the next time you open your umbrella, perhaps in the grey hush of morning or under a soft twilight shower, consider the strange politeness of it. The way you angle it just so, the way you hesitate before shaking it off in a doorway, the way, without knowing it, you participate in a centuries-old debate, now long settled. We've come a long way from the parasol duels of Palais Royal. And still, as the clouds gather and your hand reaches for the familiar curved handle, one final question remains: how many quiet revolutions happen this way, one gentle drop at a time? It's early morning in ancient Persia, perhaps around 500 BCE. The desert sun has not yet risen, but the air is already dry with the whisper of coming heat. In the distance, an enormous dome, rounded, pale, and silent, rises from the earth, like the shell of a buried giant tortoise. This is no temple nor tomb, but a practical structure with a name as soft as its function, Yakchal or ice pit. You are standing at the entrance to one of the most ingenious technologies of the ancient world. A passive refrigerator, a cold house in the middle of the sun-drenched Iranian plateau. And yes, this is where, thousands of years ago, Persian families stored ice cream, or more precisely, something like it. The Persians had long cultivated a taste for coolness, not only in food, but in architecture, clothing, and even poetry. To be able to serve a chilled rosewater sorbet to your guests in the blazing month of Tyr, roughly July, was more than indulgence. It was prestige, hospitality, and a quiet flex of scientific sophistication. So how did they manage to keep ice in the desert without electricity or machines? The secret lies beneath your feet. A yakchal looks simple from the outside, a large conical dome, often up to 60 feet tall, rising above a subterranean pit. But this was a marvel of engineering. The thick walls, often more than 2 meters wide, at the base were made of a special mortar called saruj, a mixture of sand, clay, egg whites, goat hair, lime, and ash. This composite material was not only insulating, but waterproof, perfect for keeping the precious contents cold and dry. The pit inside could stretch several meters below ground, forming a kind of ice cellar. At night during winter, workers would direct water from nearby qanats, underground irrigation tunnels, into shallow pools outside the yakchal. The water would freeze during the frigid desert nights. The next morning, blocks of ice would be carefully cut and lowered into the yakchal's core using ropes and sleds. Layer by layer, block by block, the pit would be filled, often with layers of straw or sawdust in between for insulation. The dome itself served not only to shade the interior from sunlight, but to vent warm air upward and out, thanks to a clever system of wind catchers, or badgers, strategically aligned with prevailing breezes. Hot air rose through the shaft, cool air settled inside. The system was entirely passive, requiring no fuel. Ice could last through the entire summer this way, months of searing heat above and cool contentment below. But they didn't stop at just storing ice. Persians, ever inventive with flavors, began combining ice with honey, saffron, rosewater, and pistachios to create a delicacy known as faluda, a frozen dessert of rice noodles flavored with lime and syrup. Imagine, if you will, sitting under a grapevine trellis in Shiraz in the 5th century BCE, watching dust glint golden in the distance as a servant brings you a porcelain bowl that glistens with cold threads of sweet, fragrant ice. It was, in its way, an empire of refreshment, but such treats weren't just for the wealthy. Even ordinary families, especially in larger cities like Yazd, Kashan, or Ray, participated in the seasonal rituals of ice collection and preservation. Communal yakchals were common, and ice distribution often followed strict patterns of tradition and need. In summer months, entire neighborhoods might share from a single pit, sending boys with clay jars to collect a ration of ice for that day's meal. And what meals they were. Cold drinks made with sour cherry syrup, chilled cucumber yogurt soup, even iced wheat pudding served during religious festivals. The ice wasn't just about status, it was about culture, ritual, and comfort in a land that had learned to thrive where many would wilt. The more you observe this system, the more remarkable it becomes. The wind catchers alone are worth a moment of admiration. Towering over buildings like square chimneys, they were often divided internally into veins that channeled air downward, cooling the house below. In summer, this breeze passed over wet cloths or underground pools to add evaporative cooling, creating a desert version of air conditioning. Together, these systems, yakchal, badgir, qanat, formed a triumvirate of ancient environmental engineering. They worked with nature, not against it. They harnessed the cold nights, the steady breezes, and the insulating power of Earth itself. And they remind us that the desire to be comfortable, to enjoy a little frozen sweetness after a long day, is not new. As you wander through the alleyways of ancient Yazd in your mind, the air still dry but now slightly cooler in the shade, You might hear the creak of a wooden door as someone emerges from a yakchal, bowl in hand. The question, perhaps, is not how they built such marvels. Human ingenuity often surprises us. The real wonder is this: who was the first person to take a bite of ice drenched in rose syrup and decide it was worthy of a civilization? Let's return to the cooling shadows of ancient Persia, where you find yourself standing in the inner courtyard of a well-to-do home in Ecbatana or Susa. The walls are pale and sun-dappled, and a small fountain trickles nearby, its sound softening the edges of the desert heat. You are here not as a traveller or trader, but as a guest. A servant emerges with a polished copper tray, and on it, nestled in ceramic bowls cooled in a yakchol, is something almost unbelievable for this place and era. A frozen dessert, delicate and aromatic, faluda. This is no modern ice cream. It is older, icier, and less creamy. The noodles, fine threads of starch made from wheat or rice, are mixed with semi-frozen syrup flavoured with rosewater, lime juice, and sometimes a splash of verjuice, sour grape juice. The texture is unusual, granular and soft at once, and the taste is both floral and tart. It cools the tongue, the throat, and in a place like this, even the mind. This simple bowl represents a culinary triumph, one that demanded an entire environmental system just to make it possible. But it also represented something more intimate. A moment of calm, of gentility, of luxury in an otherwise arid world. Faluda, though most likely perfected in the later Sassanid and early Islamic periods, likely traces its origins back to Achaemenid, innovations in food preservation and courtly culture. Persian kings had long prized balance, in flavour, in architecture, in philosophy. A dish that combined the intensity of summer with the chill of winter in one bite was considered an artful paradox, a conversation in texture and temperature. And the Persians weren't alone in this appreciation. As trade routes expanded, particularly the Royal Road and later the Silk Road, recipes and ideas flowed alongside silk, spices, and music. Chinese envoys reported marveling at the desert cooling systems in Western lands. Indian merchants wrote about the rose-scented sherbets served in high Persian courts, and Greek historians, like Herodotus, took note of the Persians' habit of eating well even in the harshest conditions. Over time, other frozen dishes emerged. Sharbat, yes, the ancestor of our modern sherbet. Flavoured, sweetened drinks served over ice or snow, often with herbs like mint or basil, and stored in large earthenware vessels to preserve coolness. Bastani sonati, a later invention, perhaps born in the Safavid period, combining faluda with a creamy base, often scented with saffron, cardamom and salep, orchid root powder. This began to resemble what we now think of as Persian-style ice cream. Even iced pomegranate seeds, gently pressed into snow and drizzled with honey, were enjoyed as casual summer street snacks. What's remarkable is that many of these dishes were seasonally shared, passed down orally, and rarely recorded in exact recipes. Their continuity across centuries speaks to a broader Persian philosophy. Food as seasonal art, not science. You made what the weather allowed, and you shared it, with guests, family, and strangers alike. Meanwhile, behind the bowls and trays, a vast infrastructure worked invisibly. Ice harvesting was labour-intensive and done primarily at night in winter. Men, often paid labourers or enslaved individuals, worked under moonlight to fill shallow, clay-lined basins. When the water froze, they broke the ice, stacked it in blocks, and loaded it into wooden carts. These were hauled into yakchols, sometimes across several kilometres. There, the ice would be layered with straw and trampled flat, much like stacking. Thatch. There were even seasonal festivals to mark the beginning of the ice harvest. In Yazd and Kerman, families would light lanterns near the freezing basins to greet the frost, offering prayers that the night be cold enough for thick layers to form. Success meant a cool summer. Failure meant a long, hot one, and the ice wasn't just for food. It played a role in preserving medical herbs, cooling fevers in hospitals and homes, storing perishable ceremonial goods during summer weddings and festivals. Even letters from travelers, Arab, Mongol, and Ottoman, remarked with amazement on the abundance of ice in Persian cities, especially in a land where daytime temperatures could soar above 40 degrees, 104 degrees. These guests were often surprised by another feature, the quiet of it all. No roaring furnaces, no labouring machines, just water, wind, geometry, and patience. In fact, the elegance of Persian cooling systems would go on to influence other empires. In Mughal India, ice storage towers and water-cooled palaces followed. Similar logic. In North Africa, domed ice pits appear, adapted for local conditions. Even parts of medieval Europe experimented with natural refrigeration, inspired by Eastern techniques, though the climate was less cooperative. Still, nowhere was it quite as refined or as deeply integrated into daily life as in Persia. Let's pause again in the shade of the Yakchal. You may notice, behind the home, a narrow stairwell leading downward into the earth. If you were to descend it, the air would grow sharply cooler. The silence would deepen. You'd be met with rows of rectangular ice blocks, some still slightly wet, others rimmed with frost. The smell is faintly musty, but clean, like packed snow. In the corner, on a clay shelf, sits a lidded jar. Inside, a thick syrup of rose petals, sugar, and a hint of vinegar. It's waiting to be poured over a fresh bowl of faluda, to be served to a guest, perhaps you, under a fig tree before the sun climbs too high. And as you sit there, bowl in hand, it's worth asking, how many other ancient technologies were driven not by war or conquest, but by the quiet desire to serve something cold and beautiful to a friend on a hot day? Imagine walking through modern-day Yazd or Kerman in the late afternoon. The wind still sweeps across the parched earth, curling dust around your ankles. But there, in the middle of a residential neighborhood or quietly tucked behind a mosque, still stands a yakchal, perhaps a little crumbled but unmistakable, a dome of mud brick rising out of the earth like a fossilized seashell, whispering of a time when cold was a luxury, not a default. Most people pass it by without a second glance, but if you listen closely, that dome contains the memory of thousands of hands, centuries of ingenuity, and a kind of ambition that doesn't often make it into the history books. Not the ambition to conquer or destroy, but to comfort, to refresh, to offer a frozen delicacy in the middle of the blazing Iranian plateau. In its own quiet way, the yakchal represents one of the earliest large-scale human attempts at environmental engineering. It required the coordination of hydrology via qanats, architecture, with domed insulation and thick saruj walls, and meteorology, timing freezing nights with water flow. It was a product of scientific intuition passed down through generations, guided more by observation than theory, long before thermodynamics had a name. And then, like many things in history, it was nearly forgotten. With the rise of mechanical refrigeration in the 19th and 20th centuries, ice became globally accessible. The quiet genius of passive cooling gave way to humming motors, coils, and chemical coolants. The yakchals fell into disuse, some collapsing entirely, others used as grain storage or simply abandoned. Ice no longer arrived with the harvest moon, nor was it celebrated with lanterns. It was just there, in your freezer, at the corner store, at every wedding banquet. But in the last few decades, something curious has happened. A few architects and engineers, both in Iran and abroad, have begun to revisit the ancient technologies of Persia. With modern climate concerns rising and the demand for low-energy solutions growing, the idea of passive cooling, of storing winter's gifts for summer's trials, has returned with a new kind of urgency. Some of these projects are startlingly ambitious. In 2017, a team of Iranian architects constructed a modern yakchal in Kerman province using traditional saruj and natural ventilation. The goal, not just to preserve a heritage site, but to test how much ice could be stored without electricity in the 21st century. In India and parts of North Africa, experiments are underway to adapt Yakchal-inspired structures to rural communities lacking reliable power, using dome-shaped ice houses to preserve food and medicine. Even in wealthy countries, there's rising interest in Persian-style wind catchers, badgers, as an alternative to air conditioning. You'll now find passive towers in experimental homes across Arizona, Dubai, and even parts of southern Spain, all inspired by designs over 2,000 years old. The appeal is clear. These systems are silent, non-polluting, and beautiful. They require almost no moving parts. Their elegance lies in their simplicity, and they remind us that comfort doesn't always need to be complicated. Sometimes it just takes a little patience and a deep respect for the land. But the revival isn't purely architectural. Persian cuisine has also seen a resurgence of interest in its ancient chilled delights. You can now find high-end ice cream parlors in Tehran, Shiraz, and Isfahan offering faluda served the old way, lightly frozen, rose-scented, and topped with sour cherry syrup. Some even use locally harvested winter ice, stored in modern insulated pits in homage to the Yakchal system. At weddings, guests might receive iced desserts served in tiny metal cups nestled in crushed ice, just as they did centuries ago. And festivals commemorating the winter ice harvest, once thought extinct, are now being revived in a few desert towns. But these reconnections go beyond nostalgia. They are about reclaiming a relationship with the land, understanding that even in the harshest environments, ancient people found ways to thrive with creativity and humility. It's a lesson increasingly relevant in an age of climate extremes. And so, perhaps one last time, let us return in imagination to the courtyard of a Persian home. The sun has set. A cool breeze rustles the vines. Candles flicker in ceramic holders. Someone brings out a shallow bowl. Inside, you recognize the unmistakable texture of shaved ice, layered with syrup and a few crushed pistachios. A dish older than many empires, served simply, without ceremony. It's a reminder that not all history is loud. Some of it is slow, patient, engineered in silence, preserved in shadow, served with rosewater on a warm night. As you finish your dessert, a question might linger, not just about how this technology came to be, but what other ancient comforts have we forgotten, hidden in the dust, waiting for the world to get hot enough to remember them. It's a damp morning in Paris, sometime around 1675. The cobblestones of the Pont Neuf are slick with a fine drizzle. You're walking slowly, because everyone is. No one hurries in this kind of weather, especially not the fashionably dressed. The air smells of wet wool, roasted chestnuts, and the faint tang of the Seine. Around you, the street hums not with traffic, but with commerce. Tooth drawers hawking their services, pamphlet sellers arguing over satire, and curiously, a line of young boys holding large cloth-covered sticks. These are not canes or walking sticks. They are umbrellas, or what passes, for umbrellas in 17th century Paris. They're called parapluies, which literally means against the rain, but owning one outright was rare, particularly in France, where until recently, umbrellas were more often seen shading nobles in sunny gardens than protecting common folk from street muck. What you're seeing is the beginning of a very specific urban phenomenon, umbrella rental. These boys, usually apprentices, errand runners, or the sons of tavern keepers, stand ready to escort wealthier Parisians across bridges or between shops. They don't hand over the umbrellas, that would be too risky. Instead, they accompany the patron, walking beside them, carefully shielding their wig or powdered hat from the drizzle until they arrive safely under a doorway or canopy. The cost, a few sous. But etiquette, that's another matter entirely. You see, umbrella use in 17th century Paris wasn't just about keeping dry. It was a theatrical performance governed by class, custom, and endless social nuance. For instance, one did not share an umbrella with someone of a different social class unless the person of lower rank held it. One must keep the umbrella slightly tilted, so as not to block the view of passing carriages or the facades of elegant buildings. And if two umbrella bearers approached from opposite directions on a narrow street, there was often a brief, awkward negotiation about who would lower their canopy first. Sometimes this turned into an argument, occasionally a duel. That's not a joke. There are multiple records of disputes over parapluie priority, particularly among minor nobles who saw a blocked umbrella path as a personal insult. One pamphlet from 1682 mockingly refers to the gentle art of umbrella, dueling, complete with diagrams of how one might brandish a cane in defense of damp honor. But it wasn't just the elite who fussed over etiquette. By the late 1600s, the umbrella had begun to trickle downward into the merchant and artisan classes, and with it came all kinds of debates. Should women be allowed to carry their own umbrellas, or only be accompanied by a manservant with one? Was it rude to open an umbrella under an arcade? What if someone's umbrella accidentally dripped on your hat in church? Parisian newspapers and satirical broadsheets were full of these concerns. One popular cartoon showed two elegantly dressed men attempting to cross paths under umbrellas, only to get hopelessly entangled and end up in the Seine. Another described the epidemic of umbrella envy, where middle-class shopkeepers invested in umbrellas purely to appear upwardly mobile, even if they rarely used them. And then, of course, came the real practical problem. Umbrellas were terrible. These early models were heavy, awkward, and prone to collapsing in the wind. Most had ribs made of whalebone or wood, and the fabric was often oiled canvas, which cracked and peeled over time. A strong gust could turn your expensive French parasol into an embarrassing public spectacle, something satirists and playwrights loved to exaggerate. Still, despite their flaws, umbrellas were deeply symbolic. They represented a desire to control one's environment, a portable roof, a personal space, a marker of taste. In the crowded, chaotic streets of 17th century Paris, that was no small luxury. Their slow acceptance also tells us something else: how small inventions become cultural flashpoints, especially when they intersect with fashion, class, and weather. At the heart of this slow, soggy revolution was not a single inventor or royal decree, but rather thousands of ordinary people. Umbrella boys, dueling dandies, curious merchants, and practical women negotiating, one rainy step at a time, what it meant to walk through the world with your own portable patch of sky. As the rain lightens and the Pont Neuf dries, you might wonder, how did such a mundane object inspire so much fuss? And what happened when umbrellas finally went mainstream? By the early 18th century, umbrellas were no longer an oddity on the streets of Paris. They were an inconvenient necessity. The city's weather had not improved, and its narrow streets had not widened. But the sheer number of people attempting to dodge puddles beneath cloth canopies had multiplied tenfold. And with them came an evolution in both design and behavior. The once lumbering parasols of the 1600s, made with thick canvas and stiff wooden ribs, were slowly replaced with lighter, more flexible constructions, some using hollowed cane shafts, and others experimenting with silk coverings or thinner varnished fabric, still prone to turning inside out during a good gust, but considerably more wieldable. And as umbrellas became physically easier to carry, they also became socially easier to claim. Owning an umbrella outright, once the domain of nobles and physicians, became fashionable among merchants, notaries, bookbinders, even well-to-do bakers. It was no longer enough to rent a parapluie boy on the Pont Neuf. One had to possess one's own, preferably imported, preferably Italian. This transition posed a problem, of course. Where do you put your umbrella when indoors? Parisian cafes, already becoming the city's new civic salons, began installing small umbrella hooks by the door, though no one quite agreed on whether they were communal or reserved. Some theatres issued umbrella checks at the door, like hats or cloaks. Others simply refused to allow them inside, prompting angry letters to editors. And, in one case, a minor riot in the vestibule of the Théâtre du Palais Royal. To complicate things further, gender entered the fray. Women, previously discouraged from handling umbrellas themselves, began doing so with unapologetic flair. Umbrellas became fashion accessories, delicate, pastel-coloured, sometimes trimmed in lace or embroidery. Engraved handles, floral fabric, and coordinated gloves became the mark of the umbrella-savvy Parisian. Magazines offered tips on how to close a parapluie with grace. And etiquette manuals debated whether a woman should ever offer her umbrella to a man, generally no. And while men's umbrellas remained plainer and often larger, even they could not escape the shifting tides. By the mid-1700s, umbrella etiquette had become a kind of dance, part practical, part performative. One held it just so when greeting a friend. One must never rest it tipped down on a wooden floor. One certainly did not shake it off indoors unless prepared to apologize to half the room. Still, not everyone embraced the trend. Philosophers like Rousseau scoffed at umbrellas, calling them feeble contraptions of the overly civil. The umbrella to them was a symbol of detachment, a tool for those who wished to stay untouched by nature. One anecdote, perhaps apocryphal but popular in cafes, claimed that Rousseau once walked directly into a thunderstorm rather than accept the loan of a parasol. On the other end of the spectrum, tradesmen and street workers resisted umbrellas. For purely pragmatic reasons, they were too delicate, too fussy, too expensive to replace. A baker's apprentice might tuck his apron over his head and press on. A flower seller might duck beneath a shop awning and wait it out. For them, the umbrella was a bourgeois indulgence, an accessory of a life with margins. And yet, by the late 18th century, the umbrella had managed something few fashion items achieve. It had crossed class lines while still holding symbolic weight. It was protection. It was propriety. It was a personal sphere in a crowded city, and as tensions in France mounted, political, economic, and social, the umbrella began to appear in increasingly peculiar places. Revolutionary pamphlets sometimes depicted nobles with enormous umbrellas, shielding them from the storm of common unrest. During the earliest days of the French Revolution, one satirical cartoon showed Louis XV beneath a canopy labelled tradition, while peasants hurled metaphorical hailstones labelled hunger and debt from below. But the umbrella wasn't just a target of mockery, it was also a tool of subversion. According to scattered police reports from 1790, 1792, some revolutionaries used umbrellas to conceal pamphlets, seditious letters, even small weapons. Hidden inside the folds of the canopy or hollowed handles, they moved unnoticed through Parisian checkpoints. One informant even claimed that a known Jacobin courier carried messages tucked into a pink umbrella's metal ribs. The irony, of course, is that just as the umbrella reached peak metaphor, the actual streets of Paris were becoming more treacherous than ever, not because of weather, but because of people. Barricades blocked major avenues, mobs marched, speeches echoed down narrow alleys, and umbrellas, once wielded with careful social choreography, were now snapped closed for quicker movement, or even dropped altogether in the rush of events. One particularly rainy afternoon in 1793, an unnamed man was arrested near the Place de la Révolution for refusing to remove his umbrella during the execution. The charge, obstructing the view of others. The penalty? Unknown. We don't know what happened to the man, nor do we know what kind of umbrella he carried, but it's worth pausing to imagine him, standing alone in a crowd, shielding himself. From the rain, perhaps from more than just the weather, in the middle of a city trying to reinvent itself from the cobblestones up. As the revolution thundered on and the monarchy collapsed, so did many of the old codes of decorum, but some things persisted. People still didn't like being dripped on. People still squabbled about sidewalk space. And somehow, umbrellas, awkward, fragile and beloved, continued their slow march into everyday life. Which raises an oddly specific question. How did the humble umbrella survive the guillotine, the empire, and the industrial age to become what it is today? When Napoleon came to power in the early 1800s, Paris was, in many ways, unrecognizable from the damp, ornate city of the Louis XIV era. The bridges were busier, the streets were more congested, and the umbrellas, they had evolved, once again, not just in form, but in function. In the aftermath of the revolution and during the rise of industrial capitalism, the parapluie underwent a surprisingly sturdy transformation. What had once been a fragile luxury item became an engineered consumer good produced in small workshops and eventually in modest factories. In 1808, Paris was home to no fewer than 77 umbrella makers. By 1830, there were over 250. The booming demand was not just driven by fashion, but by infrastructure, newly paved boulevards, wider sidewalks, more street lamps. The modern city was emerging, and people, more pedestrians than ever, needed gear to navigate it. The umbrella became a kind of urban armor. One of the greatest innovations came in the 1850s with the adoption of steel-ribbed frames, which replaced the old whalebone and wooden supports. The result? Umbrellas that were significantly lighter, more durable, and less prone to snapping dramatically in a breeze.